Brilliant. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this the webinar on the UNGASS for our European partners. This is the latest in a series of webinars that we've been hosting. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yeah, so this is the latest in a series of webinars that we're hosting at IDPC. Each one focused on a different region and looking at the UNGAS and trying to answer some questions that our partners may have about this meeting and what it really means for drug policies in the region. So just to quickly introduce IDPC. We're a global network of civil society organizations around the world. We currently have more than 140 members around the world, including a number in Europe. We work to promote drug policy debate and to promote civil society participation in these debates. And we promote a drug policy that is based on the best evidence, on public health, on human rights, on development, and on security. And we're based in London. We're a relatively small secretariat for the organisation. My name is Jamie Bridge. I'm the Senior Policy Manager at the organisation, and I've been here since 2012. And I'm joined today by Anne Fordham, who's our Executive Director, who will be presenting a bit later on, more specifically around some of the European dimensions of this, because Anne Fordham is actually the Civil Society Task Force representative for Western Europe as well. So Anne can talk more about that later. So today we're going to try and cover some ground. We have an hour together to try and cover some ground about what the UNGAS is, to talk about why it's important now in 2016, to talk about what the implications are for Europe, and to talk about how civil society can engage in these coming months. So first of all, what is the UNGAS? The General Assembly at the United Nations is the highest policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations. So it's the kind of the top of the tree when it comes to UN decision-making. And special sessions can be called by member states or by the Security Council, and they can be on a range of different topics. This isn't just something about drug policy. You can see here some examples of previous General Assembly special sessions, or UNGASs. For example, we've had ones on drug policy before. The last one on drugs was in 1998. So they're not common occurrences. I believe that this current UNGAS is maybe the 30th one that's ever been held on any topic. And other topics include HIV in children and development, etc. And at the last UNGAS on drugs in 1998, the international community came together and it did so under this banner of a drug-free world, we can do it. And that kind of sums up the mindset in 1998 in terms of the approach to the drug problem. It was very much about eradication, ridding the world of drug use and drug production, and it even set a target that by 2008 the world would be drug-free. Which, as I'm sure you're all very much aware, that target has been spectacularly missed. So the UNGAS this year will take place in April in New York. And it was a meeting that was requested as an emergency by the presidents of Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia, arguably three of the countries of the world that have maybe felt the consequences of the war on drugs the hardest. Their call was supported by a large number of countries around the world who all agreed that now is the time to have an open debate about drugs. And it came in the context of increasing momentum for drug policy reform and an increasing debate about how the current approach isn't working and we need to look at alternatives. When it was announced in 2013, it was welcomed by the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who called for member states to use the opportunity to have an open debate that considers all the options. And what we see now is there's some countries are keen to limit that debate. They don't want to talk about all the options. They only want to talk about the things that they've agreed to recently. And so this is a really important statement from Ban Ki-moon when he's saying that we need to put all the options on the table to find out the best way to deal with drugs. So why is this happening now, and why is it so important that it's happening now? The international response to drugs over the last 50 or 60 years has been based on international drug conventions that are signed up to by almost every member state. And they're very proud of what they call the Vienna Consensus, the idea that the whole world agrees on how to respond to drugs. But what we're seeing now is that this consensus is being stretched. Arguably, it's even being broken on some key issues. And so that's why it's important now to have this debate about drugs. Firstly, we have harm reduction. Hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of harm reduction. It's something that's widely endorsed, very, very extensively proven in Europe and elsewhere. It's included in national policies by around 91 countries, of whom most have needle and syringe programs, most have opiate substitution therapy. But the coverage and the funding for these interventions remains very poor. Harm Reduction International have been doing some excellent research in this area, looking at the global state of harm reduction. And although Europe is in a better position in terms of harm reduction than many other regions, we have a strong history of leadership on harm reduction. We were some of the first countries to adopt this approach were European countries. But there's still a lot to be done even here in Europe, particularly as we now see in some countries there's a rollback where the advances that have been made in harm reduction are being neglected or undermined by new policy approaches that maybe overlook the huge impact that harm reduction has had on public health in this region. So harm reduction remains a key tension in the United Nations debates, because there's a large group of countries, including European countries and the European Union, that very much support harm reduction, but then there's another group of countries who are very much against harm reduction, or at least against the use of the words harm reduction. Another key tension is around decriminalisation. Now, this approach is nothing new. It's been countries have been taking this approach where you treat drug offences as administrative offences rather than criminal ones. This approach has been around for a long time, and it is permitted by the drug conventions for drug use at least. And UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, have confirmed this. In recent years, this approach has been endorsed, particularly in the context of HIV epidemics and effective HIV responses. It's been endorsed by the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, and various other agencies. It's practiced in at least 21 countries around the world to varying degrees, and with a variety of different models employed. Possibly the most famous of which is Portugal, which since 2001 decriminalised the possession of all drugs for personal use, and they've seen really positive results because of this policy change. New HIV infections have fallen, overdose deaths have fallen, and crucially, drug use itself has not increased. I should stress here that although Portugal did change their law, they decriminalised drugs, but at the same time they also invested extensively in their health services. So it wasn't one or the other; they actually did both, and that's why they've had such good results. And we can see from this map the extent to which decriminalisation is active in Europe. There's a number of countries have decriminalised drug use, either de jure, which means by actually changing their laws, or de facto, which means that in practice drug use is decriminalised, even though the law might still remain a criminal one. And there's a lot of discussions happening around this. For example, in Ireland at the moment, there's wide-ranging debates in Ireland about whether they want to follow this route as well. So, Europe is really at the epicenter of this approach, but yet maybe isn't speaking out as strongly in favor of it at the international level as it could be. Some other key tensions that have emerged in recent years, for example, Bolivia attempted for years to change the drug conventions so that to allow the indigenous use of coca leaf. Coca leaf is currently banned because it's a precursor, it's the source of cocaine. But Bolivia have tried to change this because in Bolivia, coca leaf has a kind of deep-rooted cultural and indigenous purpose. But after years of trying, they weren't getting any positive results from the international community. So they took the step of actually withdrawing from the international drug conventions. And then they joined them again later, around a year later, with a reservation that said, we agreed to follow all these conventions except with regards to coca leaf. And this is something that's entirely allowed within the treaty law. It's something that is permissible within international law. Bolivia were one of the first countries to actually put this into practice, and it really did challenge the integrity of the system because it was a huge admission that actually this consensus that is said to exist doesn't really exist on the ground. And it was Bolivia's way to reconcile their international drug control commitments with their domestic commitments to protecting the human rights and the indigenous rights of their people. And in these pictures here, you can see President Morales actually attended the international UN drug debates in Vienna with a whole range of different coca products in front of him, and actually challenged the participants at this meeting to say, look, I use coca leaf. That doesn't make me a criminal. And next up is particularly around cannabis. There's been in recent years a lot of policy developments around cannabis, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Uruguay became the first country to fully regulate a cannabis market in 2013, and we're now beginning to see some of the results from this. It allows for private cultivation of cannabis, and all commercial sales and production are strictly controlled by the state. So they've created a heavily regulated but legal cannabis market. And then similarly, across the pond in the USA, there's been a lot of developments around cannabis in the USA. Many states now have medical marijuana schemes in place or have decriminalized cannabis. And even more importantly, since 2012, we now have regulated markets in 4 US states. And again, we're beginning to see the positive results that these markets are having. And we hope there's more to come. There's talk of other ballot initiatives taking place even this year. For example, California will be a significant ballot initiative if it's successful, because California is such a vast state. And a change of cannabis policy in California could have a lot of implications for the USA. And crucially, this has all gone hand in hand with a real shift in public opinion around cannabis. And as you can see from this graph, 2013 was a kind of landmark occasion, because in these long-term polls that have been conducted in the general public, it was the first time that more people believed that cannabis should be legal than believed it should be illegal. So there's been a real shift in opinion, which has in turn allowed these ballot initiatives to take place. And then the final major tension we wanted to highlight to help set the scene is just around incarceration and the mass incarceration of people who use drugs. It's estimated that 1 in 5 people around the world in prison are there because of drug offences, and the vast majority of them are there for simple drug possession offences. So these very much are, they're not the kingpins, they're not the ones making vast profit from the drug trade. These are people who use drugs or people involved in the drug market at a very, very low level. And this reality has led a lot of political actors to realize that it's an unsustainable situation, both financially but also socially. And here you can see a lovely quote that came from Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General in the USA. The USA obviously being the champion of the war on drugs for many years, has now seen the impact that this has had on its own domestic incarceration rates, particularly for certain ethnic groups. And here you see the Attorney General declaring that too many Americans are going to prison for no good law enforcement reason. We cannot simply prosecute or incarcerate our way to becoming a safer country. And this reality, this is very much linked to the drug policy in the USA. We are now seeing President Obama issuing pardons for drug offenders who have been given hefty sentences for relatively minor offences. And finally, I just wanted to end on this quote, which is a quote I use quite a lot, from Kofi Annan, who was the former UN Secretary General, but is now on the Global Commission for Drug Policy. And his statement that drugs have harmed many people, but bad governmental policies have harmed many more. And I think this really is, this sums up quite nicely why now is the time that we have to have this debate. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Anne, who's going to talk us through a bit more about the implications for Europe in particular. Anne?
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Jamie, for that very comprehensive introduction to and overview of the UNGASS, and particularly some of the important drug policy developments that are happening around the world that create this kind of backdrop to this current debate that's happening on international drug policy in the UNGASS moment itself. So yes, moving on to the European dynamics and discussions. Yeah, so I think we can move to the next slide. Yeah. So for Europe, the debate is incredibly important, and we've seen that generally Europe has in the past always been a strong advocate for the basic principles of human rights, and there's been a very clear and very well documented understanding of the human rights catastrophe, essentially, that the war on drugs has led to in many parts of the world. So in terms of the European perspective, the current approach, which is very punitive and repressive, has to end, and Europe has to play a leading role in terms of how to shift away from that approach globally. There is a greater public awareness of the most problematic elements of repressive drug control policies, and that awareness needs to be brought to bear on the UNGASS process itself. As Jamie very clearly outlined, the UNGASS is an incredibly important opportunity at the highest political level within the UN structures, and it's an opportunity for governments to be honest and open about what works in terms of drug control policies and what has not worked and therefore needs to change. And we really hope that Europe will engage and call for this opportunity to have an honest and open debate. As we know, well, some of you may not know, the drug control agencies and architecture is based in Vienna. That's where the Commission on Narcotic Drugs is based, and that's where the member states that's their seat of discussing international drug control policy. For many years, they've had this so-called consensus on how drug policy should be enacted at the national level. Largely repressive, trying to limit the illicit drug market through criminal justice and law enforcement measures. And that consensus is rightfully under threat, but it also is leading to a questioning of the UN conventions on drug control. And there needs to be an honest debate again about how to modernize the system. We also want the UNGASS opportunity to be a moment where member states talk about the idea that the UN is not speaking as one voice on the issue of drug control. So we have the UN agency, again, based in Vienna, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, who, have in the past talked about the problems, the negative unintended consequences, should we say, of drug control policies as they're currently formulated. But there hasn't been enough engagement, we would say, from other agencies, for example, UNDP, the Development Agency, or the WHO, in terms of how drug control has intersected with their mandates. We've seen more engagement from UN agencies in this current process around the UNGASS, and some very good submissions from UNDP, for example, and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. UNAIDS recently released a paper just before Christmas called Public Health and Human Rights, which was very important. So they're coming more into the discussion now, and there's an important need for the UN agencies in particular to be more aligned on what are the problems with the system, how are UN mandates affected by drug policies that are ineffective or damaging, and how do we improve that picture. We've also seen, and again this has been a key issue for Europe, a very disproportionate investment in the law enforcement approach that I mentioned, at the expense of investment in health and harm reduction. And the UNGASS provides an opportunity to acknowledge that and to perhaps consider implementing some targets in terms of how to reinvest resources away from law enforcement into health and social programs. And finally, the important thing to say is that, in terms of the UNGASS, national policies in the past have had an impact on the international debate. So we've seen that with harm reduction policies, particularly that's been a lead from Europe, with countries in Europe implementing harm reductions programs early. The UK is a good example, Germany is a very good example, and then pushing for a harm reduction, acknowledgement of harm reduction and harm reduction response at the international level. So there's sort of a circular debate between national policies and what happens in the international discussion, which is important. So in terms of the UNGASS, what are the continued selected areas of contention? Or some might say also some areas where there might be some progress, but it's still challenging. So we've seen some language in the process so far around the non-punishment of people who use drugs. So the idea that drug use itself should not be a punishable or a criminal offense. And that's an interesting debate that still needs to be broadened out at the UN level. We know that we've seen in some of the member states submitting documents for the UNGASS, submitting inputs for the UNGASS outcome document, this idea that people who use drugs should not be punished, should not be criminalized. That is still not a widely accepted concept. So that's still a debate that we see will probably come up in the preparations for the UNGASS over the next few months. Harm reduction, we've already talked a bit about that. Jamie also discussed it. It's still contentious, unfortunately. There's some acceptance at the UN level, particularly in Vienna at the CND, around harm reduction interventions, such as needle and syringe program, opiate substitution therapy. Those interventions are largely accepted in the consensus-based UN negotiations, but it's still a very narrow reference to harm reduction, and the idea that harm reduction should be permitted for all types of drug use is still not generally accepted as a concept. So that's still a contentious area, and one where we expect to see, again, some debate. What's interesting in the current negotiations for the UNGASS, and this is very much being led from Europe and from the European Union, which is positive, is around the proportionality of sentences for drugs offences. So drugs offences globally are very disproportionate because of the largely punitive and repressive thrust that we've seen. And, you know, as Jamie mentioned, globally our prisons are full, and the prison population globally continues to grow, and a big factor in that is for low-level non-violent drug offences. So there is a recognition that we need to redress proportional sentences, but also the EU has always been very strong on the abolition of the death penalty for all offences, and in particular also for drugs offences that is relevant for this debate. Ensuring access to essential, or we increasingly now say controlled medicines, that's an area where there is general consensus. There's been a large focus on limiting the drug market, reducing the illicit drug trade, stopping people from entering into the drug trade or entering into use, but not enough attention has been paid to ensuring access to certain types of medicine, substances such as morphine for pain relief, for example. And that's meant that we're facing a pain epidemic, with many people in many parts of the developing world in particular not having basic access to pain medication. So there's a general acknowledgement that that needs to change. So these are areas of debate, contention, and possible progress. So where does the EU, the European governments, where do they sit within this picture? Where Europe has the possibility to be strong, where the EU has the possibility to be strong, is where they agree a common position, where they have a strong collective voice. There are 28 EU member states, and when they agree and coalesce around certain positions, they can be very strong. In the past, where they've been strong, for example, is on the issue of alternative development. So the EU has always maintained a very clear position on alternative development, that no subsistence farmers should be subject to forced eradication of their drug crops, which is essentially their basic livelihoods, without proper sequencing to be put in place. So that means that without ensuring that they have access to an alternative means of livelihood. We saw on harm reduction, as I mentioned, in 2009, which was the last sort of really high-level moment in the international drug policy debate. That's when they agreed a new political declaration and action plan, which runs to 2019, the 10-year plan. But there the EU coalesced around harm reduction. They didn't manage to get the words harm reduction into the final statement, although they fought hard for it, and they came together and made an interpretive statement when the political declaration was accepted, saying that they would interpret what the agreed language was, which was related support services, rather oblique, but to mean harm reduction. And they continue to stand by that, so that's important. I already mentioned their key position, one of their red lines, that has been a red line for many years, will continue to be a red line, is around the abolition of the death penalty. And they will fight hard on that. It's difficult because China, Iran, Pakistan, those countries, Singapore, they will argue for state sovereignty and maintaining the use of the death penalty. But the EU will attempt to try and get some language in around that, and it will be challenging for them. The EU within the CND has been also strong on civil society engagement and ensuring the visibility of civil society organisations to have a voice and to be able to participate in the UNGASS preparations. So those are areas where we've seen European leadership, but we do see that European leadership could be stronger. You see there the slide. There are times in this debate where there is a sense that European governments are burying their heads in the sand, and there is a sense of complacency within Europe. The urgency that Jamie talked about that's coming from Latin American governments, we unfortunately are not mirroring that urgency here in Europe. You know, Europe always talks about evidence-based policy, that, you know, European governments are sure that we are making policy decisions based on evidence, but we're still very focused within the European Union around, you know, drug seizures, interdiction efforts between borders. There's still a lot of investment in what we call supply reduction at the expense of, as I mentioned, of harm reduction. And what's the evidence base for all of that investment in interdiction efforts, precursor control, etc. The drug market is stronger and more diverse than ever. Is that investment worth it? Is that really based on evidence? That's a question that I think we should be putting to European governments. In terms of international developments, we've seen cannabis policy changing, and we've seen developments in Uruguay, in the US at state level. These are important shifting dynamics around cannabis creating regulated cannabis markets for recreational use. And even though in the EU, in many EU countries, in smaller jurisdictions, we have some interesting cannabis policy, experimentation. Say the cannabis social clubs in Spain is one. For many years, the coffee shop system in the Netherlands being an example of innovation. So we have these responses in the EU countries, but in terms of the global debate, Europe does not engage. As I mentioned before, Europe has avoided some of the sharpest edges of the war on drugs. We don't see the same levels of violence as we've seen in Latin America associated with the drug trade and with the government's response to the drug trade. So there's a sense of complacency, a sense of we're all right, and that sort of drives the response. The UN conventions, particularly the developments around cannabis, generally present a challenge to the conventions. The conventions were set up to prohibit recreational use of these substances under international control. So what's happening around cannabis does, create an inconsistency, and that's not to say that those governments shouldn't be going ahead with cannabis reform initiatives, but they should be honest about the tension that this creates and a need to have an open debate about how we move forward and how we modernize the system. And that appetite for that discussion is definitely not coming from the EU. And there's been a lack of visibility throughout the UNGASS process, should we say. Latin American countries, many of them, Mexico, Colombia, to name a few, Uruguay, Costa Rica, they've been quite progressive and vocal in the UNGASS preparations. And European governments, the EU, quite muted, I would say, very much business as usual, and really not showing leadership so far, and not solidarity with Latin American governments facing some of the most damaging aspects of the so-called war on drugs. So, we really want EU governments to be much more strongly engaged, much more visible, and hold strong on the issues where we've seen them hold strong around harm reduction, around human rights provisions, and now we're seeing them coming into the debate on proportionality of sentences, and we think that's important, and we hope that they will, really push for progress in the areas where they have been able to find common positions in particular. So IDPC as a network has developed in broad consultation with our membership 5 asks for the UNGASS itself. You can find all of our documents on our website and much more information on the UNGASS. The first is to ensure an open debate, an open and inclusive debate. I think that we've been saying from the outset that first of all, the debate needs to be honest about what progress has been made, if any, what the challenges are that remain, what are the damaging approaches that need to be changed, but also in that open debate to include all stakeholders. So the other UN agencies that have a mandate to engage, civil society needs to have a voice and be visible, academics, scientists who will bring the evidence to bear, they need to have a role in this debate. And that's one of our clear asks. The second ask is to reset the objectives of drug policy. This is really an ask around, the indicators that we've been using to measure our success. So I mentioned before the current political declaration and action plan runs to 2019. There is still a goal within that political declaration in 2019 to significantly reduce or eradicate the global drug trade. 2019 is only 3 years away, and I think there is by no indicator can we say that there's been real success towards that goal. So is that goal still realistic? Is that goal something that the international community still wants to move towards, or should we be looking more at how to manage the market in a more intelligent and sophisticated way? And then what would the metrics and indicators be that would be associated with a more enlightened approach, should we say? We also want to recognize in our third ask that there are new approaches taking place, the ones that we've mentioned around cannabis regulation, for example. You know, there might be a different way of doing things, and member states should be open to what those new approaches might be, and that it's time to consider what the alternatives that exist in terms of international drug policy. You know, if we do more of the same, we're just going to get more of the same, and we need to be open to change and modernization. Our fourth ask is a very important clear red line for all of the network, and we're really calling on governments to end the criminalization of people who use drugs. So Jamie talked about decriminalization before. You know, we're very clear, people who use drugs should not be subject to punishment of any kind. And ideally for us, that would include, you know, whether it's administrative or criminal, they would not suffer any sanctions. We recognize that many decriminalization regimes have administrative sanctions, but those administrative sanctions should not be more draconian than sometimes criminal sanctions, which has happened, say, in countries in Southeast Asia which have claimed to decriminalize, such as Vietnam. So it's important for us, and ensuring proportionality in sentences, of course, and also within that, ending the death penalty for all drugs offences as it's a violation of international law. Our final ask is really to commit to harm reduction. We know that it works. We know that it saves lives. It's currently seriously underfunded globally, and we call on governments to recognise that there needs to be much greater investment in harm reduction and in the health response to drug use in general. So those are our 5 asks for the UNGASS. And then because we're also talking about Europe, I wanted to mention a document, a set of recommendations that a group of reform NGOs within Europe have come together to devise, and also, so there was about 20 different civil society organizations that met last year in Budapest. That's why they're called the Budapest recommendations, to develop a set of recommendations really focused at the UNGASS, but also very specifically also at the European Union. So the first one was that, and again I'm going to echo some of the IDPC asks here, people who use drugs must not be subject to criminal penalties, support harm reduction and a rebalancing of resources. Again, commit to a UN-wide action plan for ensuring access to controlled medicines. Establish an agreed definition of decriminalization. We've seen that as problematic because some governments claim that we can't discuss decriminalization because we don't have an agreed definition of what it is. IDPC is coming to an agreed definition of what it is. There are many other NGOs working in this field who have clear definitions of decriminalization. The EMCCDA, the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drugs Addiction, also has a definition. So there are definitions out there that are, you know, there are some variances, but on the whole they say the same thing. So I think it would be good for the EU to commit to a workable definition of decriminalization. Of course, we're calling for proportional sentences for drugs offences. And finally, and importantly for the EU positioning, is that this group has called for a stronger involvement from the UN human rights mechanisms to look at the impact on human rights, on the enjoyment of human rights of drug control as it's currently constructed. And this is sort of a follow-up from the recent engagement from the UN human rights architecture, including an excellent report from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. So the second part of the Budapest recommendations, sort of following on from the human rights theme, is to ensure that, in the EU there are many governments that have a moratorium on the death penalty, and yet there are still areas that have been identified where EU funding is complicit in the use of the death penalty for drugs offences. So this is an important point for the EU and EU governments to really ensure that their money, taxpayers' money in the EU, does not go to governments that are continuing to implement the death penalty for drugs offences, and also going towards crop eradication schemes that are not properly sequenced, given that that's an EU common position. Another recommendation from the Budapest group is around applying development principles which address poverty and social exclusion, and broadening out the definition of development when we discuss it within drug control, so that's not just about alternative development, but it's about development more broadly, as many people are engaged in the drug trade out of economic necessity, and there needs to be a stronger recognition of that within the global debate. Oh, sorry. I've just been asked to if you have comments or questions on anything that we're saying, you can put these into the YouTube chat on the side, and we'll try to respond to your questions at the end of my presentation, or indeed if they're relevant to any of these slides, I can address them now. And then, cannabis cultivation is an important point in alternative development programs. And then the last point, which is an important one, is around, again, this idea of the UN, the tensions within the UN drug control treaties caused by some of the new policy developments, but also the issue of metrics and indicators, as I mentioned, resetting the objectives of drug control, and also the UN system-wide coherence issue. These are all issues where we think it would be important to have some sort of mechanism that tries to address some of these issues, tensions, challenges within international drug control. And one way of doing that would be for governments to set up a mechanism like an expert advisory group to look at these challenges, tensions in a more systematic way. And in fact, it could be quite a good link between the UNGASS in 2016 and the next moment in 2019, which is when the political declaration and action plan ends, and they'll have to renegotiate a new one, presumably. But then the expert advisory group could feed back on some of these key areas of tension that I've mentioned. So that's also a very clear call that this Budapest group has made, but also IDPC has made, and also a number of member states have also made in their submissions for the UNGASS. So they're looking for processes, vehicles to address some of the issues. In terms of how we can engage as civil society, we can go directly to what's happening now in the process. So the government negotiations have entered a stage of drafting the UNGASS outcome document that will be adopted in New York in April. This process we anticipate will take the next 2 to 3 months. We may see the final outcome document being finalized in Vienna at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting in March, or they may take it to New York for final discussion in April. There are many governments who are trying to close off all the language in Vienna. They don't want it to go to New York to be opened up for discussion. They just want to take the completed article to New York. And there are some governments who are saying, no, we do need to discuss it in New York because it's a UN General Assembly special session and it's our right to do so. So we'll see what happens with that. The structure of the document is an interesting point of debate. Drug control has been structured around 3 themes for the last 10 years or so, which is demand reduction, supply reduction, and international cooperation. And we're pushing for an expansion out from those themes, from those 3 themes or 3 pillars, towards themes that more adequately represent the issues within international drug policy. So the 5 themes are based on the UNGASS roundtables, and they're drugs and health, drugs and crime, drugs and human rights, new challenges, which is about NPS, but also some of these tensions with the treaties that I've mentioned, and finally, the fifth theme would be on drugs and development, and those are where we're hoping the structure will go. 7 themes is there with a question mark because the latest draft of the document does have 7 themes, but I'm not going to read those out to you now. But if you do want to look at the latest draft, I think we will make it available on our website, and it does currently have 7 themes, but I'm certain that will be up for negotiation. They're also going to be discussing operational recommendations or actions that need to come out of the UNGASS, and there'll be much debate on those. So, for example, an access to controlled medicines action plan would be a good action that we're sure something like that will come out. But then the decision to convene an expert advisory group, that's an operational recommendation that could happen, for example. So there's some examples of operational recommendations. I already mentioned the Vienna or New York dynamics. And the civil society engagement, where's that at? So very soon in New York, and this has been hard fought and hard won, there will be an informal interactive stakeholder consultation on the 10th of February. And this will be convened by the President of the General Assembly. And essentially it's got that sort of strange name of interactive stakeholder consultation, but it's really a civil society hearing. And there'll be 2 panels. There'll be one panel on public health with 4 civil society speakers, or perhaps 5. I think we've fought for that to be expanded, discussing the issues relating to public health and drug policy. And then there'll be a second panel, I think, with 8 civil society speakers on human rights and drug policy. And the President of the General Assembly will invite member states to come and participate in the consultation, hear from civil society and respond. And that the report of that consultation will be a formal input into the UNGASS process. So this is a big win for civil society and was really hard fought for by the Civil Society Task Force, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then in terms of the UNGASS debate itself, each of the roundtables under the themes I mentioned, those 5 themes, will have 1 civil society speaker on each of the panels. And that's important because civil society have often not been able to participate in these sorts of government debates as panelists. So we also see that as a win. That happened for the first time last year at the UNGASS segment of the CND, and we're very glad to see that member states have agreed that it will be the procedure for the UNGASS debate itself. So for your continuing engagement, and thank you for joining this webinar. To follow the debate, we have a lot of information on our website. We have a dedicated several pages to the UNGASS at idpc.net. The other place for you to be able to follow is on cndblog.org, where IDPC blogs almost in real time. We do at the CND, and in the other debates within 24 hours, you should see the discussion recorded on CND blog. So that's everything that member states say, their positions that they're taking. We accurately, try as much as accurately, verbatim record what they're saying and put it on the blog so that you can look and see what position which government has taken, particularly your government, and hold them accountable for what they're saying. You can also join a number of these networks. The Vienna NGO Committee is the Vienna sort of committee which NGOs that are interested in the Vienna debates are part of. The New York NGO Committee, that's the NYNGOC, which was recently revived ahead of the UNGASS and will continue after the UNGASS as well. EHRN is the Eurasian Harm Reduction Network, and then the European Harm Reduction Network as well, so if you want to remain engaged. It's also incumbent upon civil society organizations and individuals to be raising awareness about these issues, sharing information about drug policy developments and the UNGASS, and building alliances with other interested organizations, both within your own country and at the regional level. And some of these networks that I mentioned previously, including IDPC, can support you should you be interested in doing that. In terms of the government debates themselves, it's definitely useful to find out who from your government goes to the CND and seek a meeting with them. You know, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. Contact them directly, and on behalf of it. It's better as a coalition of organizations, I would say, from your country to seek a meeting with them pre the CND or the UNGASS, to have a discussion with them about your concerns and find out from them what positions they plan to take at this meeting. And then it's also good to organize a meeting with them when they get back, or seek a meeting with them when they get back, and ask them for a debrief. And so that's something that we've supported a number of partners to do in different countries. And it's a good model if you're able to get your government to engage. You can also talk to your local UN officials as well, UNAIDS and UNODC, and to some extent WHO should be able to inform you about the process and help you facilitate your civil society engagement. Define your asks and your targets. That's important for all advocacy. So what would be the asks from civil society in your country? What are the important priorities? And your targets are essentially which government officials have influence in this process. And then all civil society organizations have been invited to make submissions to the formal UNGASS website, which is at www.ungass2016.org, although I think we still face the same issue of it not being clear on that web page exactly how to make submissions. So you can get in touch with us and we can let you know exactly how to make the submission, or perhaps one of my colleagues could also paste it into the YouTube chat as we did in one of the other webinars, because I think that's useful information for everyone. And the last slide that I have is around the Civil Society Task Force. So this has been the official mechanism for NGO engagement at the UNGASS. We put this slide sort of last, really, because I think it's the Civil Society Task Force has completed most of its key tasks now, but it's important for you to know about. There has been 26, and I think most of their pictures are there, individuals on the task force, so 2 from each of the 9 UN regions, and then the rest taken from what we call affected key groups in terms of drug control policy. So there's been someone representing people who use drugs, someone representing harm reduction, someone representing recovered drug users, someone representing the prevention community, someone representing criminal justice, someone representing the community that's concerned with ensuring access to controlled medicines. So it's been a diverse group with many different ideological perspectives, but I think genuinely has worked well together, conducting regional consultations and thematic consultations, which were finally submitted last week into the task force steering group, and a formal report will be collated from all the regional and thematic consultations from global civil society as an input into this process. A very broad range of views, should we say, and as I mentioned, was instrumental in setting up the hearing, the stakeholder consultation on the 10th of February, which will be webcast as well. So even if you're not able to attend in New York, I think it will be, if you are able to follow it online, I think it'll be a really interesting and important debate. And have been working, the task force agreed from the outset that as task force members, I'm one of the Western European reps, we would not be the speakers representing civil society in the UNGASS debates on the 10th of February or at the UNGASS itself, but we would be facilitating the engagement of other civil society representatives from the most affected populations to speak, and so that we hear from people that we don't normally hear from. Member states hear from those we don't normally hear from. So thank you very much for listening in. I don't know if we have any questions. Our final slide is the Support Don't Punish campaign, another way for you to engage in calling for drug policy reform. The campaign's been running for 3 years now. We have a global day of action on June 26th every year. You can check out supportdon'tpunish.org for how you can get involved, or take your photo with the beautiful campaign logo and upload it onto the website and join the thousands of people who've already uploaded their photo to call for the end of the war on drugs, essentially. So Jamie,
Thank you, Anne.
do you want to jump back in at this point?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions on the YouTube chat from Clear in the UK. So thank you very much for watching the webinar and for sending those in. So questions around they have some cynicism about the UNGAS being just a talking shop, and that the major reforms will always take place at a national level rather than the international level. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that the national level is obviously very important, and we've seen that in the last few years, and particularly around cannabis policy. The major developments have happened at the national level. But the international debate is still a really, really important one, and it can be frustrating. It can seem very, very slow moving sometimes, and it is. And for as long as these debates are based on consensus, based on the need to find things that every country can agree to, then obviously it is going to be a frustrating process. But we are seeing things being proposed now and discussed now at the international level that we could have only dreamed of 5 years ago, as recently as 5 years ago. The draft of the outcome document, which is being debated at the moment, has entire sections on development, entire sections on human rights, and it's a real sign of the progress that's been made because of the national level shifts, but also because of an increasing momentum and awareness that the war on drugs approach just has to end. And so I think the UNGAS will have its frustrations. There will be some countries who take very regressive stances at the UNGAS. We need to work closely with our allies and with the more progressive countries to make sure that they get their voice heard. The value of the UNGAS, really, for me, is going to be the actual debate rather than the outcome document as such. I think the debate is going to be a really interesting moment, and hopefully one that we can look back on in 5, 10, 20 years and say, well, this really did mark the beginning of the end of this war on drugs. So I think, as we've tried to present in this webinar today, the UNGAS is an important opportunity. And we really encourage you all to take part in it in the ways that Anna's outlined, including the campaign, but also with the various other partners and organisations that exist to try and help you engage in that process. And did you have anything you wanted to add on that point?
Yeah, I understand the sense of frustration as well as anyone, and Jamie and I have to spend a lot of time sitting in the rooms in Vienna listening to these to the government debate. But I think you have to take a long-term view, and you have to think about what the debate was, what the tone of the debate was 20 years ago versus the debate it is today. And as I mentioned, language around the fact that people who use drugs should not be punished. I mean, genuinely, governments are submitting that and saying that from the floor, including the United States. Yes, it may be rhetoric for now, but it is a big shift. They weren't saying that even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. The proportionality of sentences point. There is no agreed UN language on proportional sentences for drugs offences, and there's an effort now from more progressive countries that are interested in human rights to try and establish that language, because they know that drug penalties have been very disproportionate. That is progress. Perhaps not as fast as we would all like, but we have to take a long-term and a view on these issues and continue to push governments to be accountable in this process. And yes, I would agree that the real reform takes place at national level, and and that cannot be ignored. That is a very important point. That's kind of the engine room that drives reform. What happens at national level around specific policies? We saw that with harm reduction. We will see that with cannabis policy. We will. Those are the national changes are important, because then that's what emboldens governments to come to the international level and fight for change. So absolutely, it's a part of it. But trying to get global agreements on things like harm reduction, on acceptance of needle and syringe programs. The UK government went to the UN with the Netherlands, with Germany, with Switzerland, and fought it out. and to some extent they've won that debate in terms of needle and syringe program, at least in terms of the acceptance in the drug control debates of such an intervention. So I think that's important, and I think that we can't disregard the interrelatedness between national policy making and international making, because then there's a loop backwards. Once you get certain measures or approaches accepted at the international level, then there's an uptake in other countries that may have not considered this approach before. So I just wanted to make that point. Are there any other questions we can respond to?
No, I think that's all now. So thank you very much for those of you participating on the webinar. We look forward to staying in touch with you, and if there's anything further we can do to help, then that's what we're here for. So please do let us know. And you can get all our contacts on the website, idpc.net. So thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks all.